Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to Bloomberg's European headquarters. My name's Konstantin Kotsias. I'm one of the directors here, and I also chair our UK office. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. We are, at Bloomberg, a firm believer in facilitating dialogue between business leaders, policy makers, thought leaders. So it's an honour to be hosting tonight's speakers for what looks like it's going to be an important examination into the effects of EU regulation on financial services. Tonight's discussion will feature the launch of Professor Congdon's Bruges Group publication, The City of London in Retreat, and we've got some first-class panellists that are going to be discussing and debating that. So with that, let me get right into the meat of the programme and turn it over to Barry Legg for his opening remarks and the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for those words of welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bloomberg Centre. You'll probably remember that this was the venue for David Cameron's speech last year, in which he proposed a renegotiation of our membership of the EU, followed by an in-out referendum. It was an occasion in which he elevated his standing and repute, probably unlike yesterday's visit to Bloomberg in New York. The Prime Minister's conclusion that we should remain members of the European Union following a process of limited reform is one which will probably be challenged by some of our speakers tonight and some of you in the audience. Our first speaker is Tim Congdon, one of Britain's leading economic commentators and an advisor to two Chancellors of the Exchequer. Tim has for over 30 years been a strong advocate of sound money and free markets in the UK's public policy debates. He founded Lombard Street Research and was its managing director for 10 years. He has written a number of books, his latest of which is Money in a Free Society, a response to the Great Recession. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the Bruges Group is proud to launch Tim's latest work, The City of London in Retreat, the EU's attack on Britain's most successful industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Tim Congdon.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. Can you hear me at the back all right? Yes. Okay, very good. In that case, I won't. If you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll speak up. But very good. I'm going to, first of all, say just a few thanks, and I want to thank the Bruges Group for publishing this document. I did a talk, The City of London Under Threat, about 5 years ago, and this is really the sequel to that exercise, and this is the, I hope in 5 years, it isn't the City of London in decline, but anyway, we'll see how we go. And also, of course, thank Bloomberg for acting as host this evening. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I hope it works. So how do we go? And there we are. Now, my assumption this evening is that we want Britain to be a success. We want Britain to be a rich and influential nation in the 21st century, and if you wish, to punch above its weight. I might just say here that not everybody agrees with that. You know, you now get all sorts of people saying we should think about the world and all of that. As far as I'm concerned, British public policy is about doing good things for we in Britain, all right? Now, pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, we've for some time been wealthier than the rest of the world, and we remain that today, but our share of world output is falling at the moment. It's relatively stable for quite a long time from the mid-80s. And I think one of the reasons is that we were doing a rather sensible kind of thing in terms of using the nation's resources. Now, I know a lot of people are nostalgic for manufacturing, and I understand. But, you know, you think about it, lawyers' bills, accountants' bills, you think how much they can charge, and the truth is that business services is where rich economies specialize. And this shows you how in the period from, in fact, this really goes back to the 1960s, but from the early 1990s, Britain's exports, these are exports, the red line is imports, but the exports are much, much higher. Exports of what I call international business services absolutely boomed, well, and boomed until 2008. And inside that total, there's financial services, the City of London. There's also many other things. There's lawyers, accountants, broadcasters, market researchers, management consultants, IT consultants, civil engineers, lots and lots of different things inside that total. They are, of course, very much located in London and the southeast. If you look at this chart, it's on an arithmetic scale, and the growth appears to be accelerating in the first decade of the 21st century. That's not quite right. And if we look at, you can just see at the end it's wobbling a bit, and that's what we're talking about this evening. You do this logarithm, and you see it's slowing, it's stable, strong growth, then it's basically growth stops. And that's, this question of, are these industries that were driving, the key driving force in the British economy for 20 years, are these industries slowing down, or is there something the matter with them? This just shows you figures a bit more specifically. We had the growth rate of these exports 13% a year for almost 20 years. I mean, that's any nation that has growth industries like that is jolly lucky, all right? And you see the last 5 years, it's only 2%. And in fact, these people who want rebalancing the economy, in fact, the exports of goods and services is rising a little bit faster. My analysis is very much in this publication about the financial sector. I don't want to sort of glorify it too much, and I know there are many critics of the financial sector, but back in 2008, the financial sector was the largest single part of this complex of growing industries. About 45% of the exports of these of the business service exports, around about £55 billion in financial services as such, and then about another 13 billion for insurance, about £70 billion. About 5% of British output was exported by these industries in 2008. They were incredibly successful industries and had been so for quite a long time. Now, this is obviously a very controversial subject, and the role of these industries in our economy is very much for discussion. As far as I'm concerned, people should be free to use their talents and skills and so on as they choose, as far as possible. I'm a liberal, and in my view, our people, British people, are making very sensible decisions by specialising in these walks of life with high incomes and so on, and these were very successful industries. Okay, I know that there are other people who say that we should be industrialists and so on. I don't agree with that, but I'm not against manufacturing, and I emphasise that here. I just want people to choose to work where they produce the best, happiest, and so on, just as suits them. But it's not a surprise to me that this was how we were specialising in the late 20th century and in the first decade of the 21st century. I was appalled, I have to say, when Lord Turner described much financial service sector activity as socially useless in Prospect magazine. Let's just be clear that at that time, the financial services, as such, not including insurance, was about 4% of GDP. And for somebody like this to criticize an activity responsible for exports equal to 4% of GDP seems to me to be the height of irresponsibility, ineptness, and so on. It's possible, I can't hardly believe it, that Lord Turner did not understand that the reason why Britain has such a large financial services sector is because such a high proportion of its output is exported. Roughly speaking, if you take out that, the red bars are the total, according to national income accounts. I'm sorry, I'm an economist, by the way, as you'll realise that the output, gross value added, is the red bars. The blue bars are the exports. The bit in between is the services that banks and insurance companies provide to us as citizens of the UK. That, by the way, is not out of line with the rest of the industrial world. What's different about Britain, what means you have a big financial sector, is these exports, all right. And it's crazy, frankly, for anybody to criticize major exporting industries. Now, just to get this clear, to talk about these industries being too big in some sense. Yeah, they were about, they're smaller now, by the way, I'll kind of come in a second. They're smaller now. They're about 3% of GDP now. UK accounts for about 3% of world. They are 0.1% of world output. All right? That's what these people, Lord Turner, Martin Wolf are saying is too big. It's 0.1% of world output. These are great growth industries, and they remain as such, I hope, in the long run. Not at the moment, but anyway. This is the picture for the composition of our exports of business services last year. And you can see that the share of financial services has declined, now a bit more than a third. And those other business services are not decrying them, not at all. Lawyers, accountants, market researchers, advertising people, so on. They're much more important now than the financial sector. And now, so let's just be clear that the financial sector has declined in the last 5 years. There's a great boom, and the financial sector has declined. Other business services still doing well, but the financial sector has declined. I realize there's been a global recession, but I think there's been another factor at work, which has been the fact that we have given the regulation of these industries to the European Union. Until 2008, the regulation of financial services was still pretty much national. In Britain, very much under the control of the Financial Services Authority and the Bank of England. This changed when the Lisbon Treaty came into effect. Well, it was passed in 2009 and gradually came into effect in 2010 and 2011. And a part of that treaty, almost unnoticed, by the way, in the public debate, was the setting up of so-called European System of Financial Supervision, and this taking the form of 3 main bodies, now with buildings and bureaucracies and infrastructure and so on. One in London, European Banking Authority in London, but obviously ultimately answerable to the European Commission. Another one in Paris, the Capital Markets Authority. And then in Frankfurt, another one which is in charge of pensions and insurance. So since 2009, financial regulation has left this country and gone to Europe. And when it was here, people might complain that there was too cozy a link between the Bank of England and the city. Okay, in the old days, maybe. Nevertheless, overall, Britain's financial sector boomed, flourished, and so on, and that boosted output employment in London and in Britain as a whole. It's sometimes said that the European Union wants these industries to flourish, and I'm just going to show you now something that's on the European Commission website. In fact, it's a presentation going back to January this year. This is the horse's mouth. This is all about the financial transaction tax. What are the objectives of this? This is all, by the way, the European Commission. It's not me, not Tim Congdon. This is the European Commission, all right? One of the objectives is create appropriate disincentives for certain transactions, all right? There are certain things that these bureaucrats in Brussels and Paris and Frankfurt don't like. They're going to stop them. That's what that's saying. Don't have any illusions about it. That's what it's saying. Okay? I couldn't help, you probably can't read it, but just at the bottom there is, this is about how they're going to proceed. And then at the bottom there's, in a nutshell, all markets, all instruments, all actors, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Bossy boots. Just at the end here, I'll show you in a second, this shows you what the European Commission expects to be the effect of the financial transactions tax. They expect the result to be a fall in turnover of shares and bonds of 15%. Quite open about that. This is a European Commission presentation. And in what they call derivatives and financial bets, minus 75%. This is the European Commission. It's not, So let's just be clear about that. Now, these activities, obviously, in terms of in the City of London, they're employing tens of thousands of people. And it's deliberate. This is the European Commission that they want to reduce the size of these industries. All right? Now, ifs and buts, no doubt, but it's pretty clear what is the intention here. And can I also say that, it's not just me in a way, that there has been, London reacted to the growth of the Eurozone and the introduction of the single European currency by taking quite a bit of financial business into London, by having its own clearing system in London. And this, of course, is now being undermined by the ECB, and the British government has taken the European authorities to the European Court of Justice. But look, this is from a column in the Financial Times. If the Eurozone has a collective interest in anything, it's to stop the city acting as its main defence. It's perfectly open and straightforward. And by the way, you could look at things that Madame Lagarde said back in 2008, 2009, before she was at the IMF. Quite clearly, the plan was to undermine the financial sector in London. Now, we're lucky to have Gerard Lyons here to talk about, I hear the official London view, because Gerard is the economic advisor to Boris Johnson. So I've just got a few slides now about London and what this means for London. Maybe I understand, one can't get around the fact that many people in Britain don't like bankers, and I kind of understand, all right. They don't like the city. And OK, having said all that, do we want this area, the centre of excellence, to be in our country or somewhere else? Do you want it to be in Singapore or Hong Kong or New York, or do you want it here, all right? This shows you, first of all, the size of London relative to the rest of the UK. London is the highest output of any of the UK regions, if you want to regard it as a region. About 3 times as much as Scotland and the Midlands and so on. These figures are a little bit out of date, but they're basically about right. So, the prosperity of London is important to the UK. And like it or not, there is no serious manufacturing sector in London today. There might have been 40, 50, 60 years ago. There isn't now. The manufacturing is less than 3% of London's economy. The drivers of the economy, as I've been explaining, are these international business service activities, which in 2011, the financial sector was still much the biggest, and in this particular way of categorizing remains so. You can see there we are, information and communication, all sorts of things inside that, financial and insurance, professional, scientific and technical, administrative and support services. So these are, you see the other things there are kind of derivative in the sense that they themselves do things for these drivers of the economy, like the retailers and the transport and so on. And the London is getting on for over 20%, getting on for a quarter of UK output. So these business service activities are absolutely critical to prosperity of London and our national prosperity too. And of course what's been going on is that the UK has been specialising in these areas, high income, high growth in a world of globalisation, very sensible response by the British people to the global outlook. Output in London is well above the UK average. The extent to which it's above the UK average may come as a surprise. This is not the same thing as income per head, because there is some equalisation because of tax. London pays much more tax than obviously most of the country per head because it's rich, and that gets redistributed. And of course, the cost of living in London is also quite high. But in terms of output, London is far more productive than any of the other regions. And I'd say the drivers here are such things as globalization, the adoption of computers in the various service activities I'm talking about means that people can carry out far more, do far more business. You know, a trader or a dealer can carry out the back office constraints in terms of paperwork. It can all be, it's much more efficient now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. You might expect that, you know, given the big gap in income and output per head, that you'd get a movement of people towards London. And of course, there has been, people have moved towards London, both from outside the UK and from within the UK. And you might expect that that would cause some equalization of incomes. Gerard, this may interest you. In fact, what's happened is that the London-UK differential has widened in the last 30, 40 years. I did these reports for the City Corporation about 10 years ago. When I found this out, I actually, you know, it was a sort of a... And that carried on until 2008, when, of course, as I showed you earlier, the growth of these industries slowed down. Quite what's going on here is a very interesting question, and it may well be that then there's a lot of growth still to come in these activities, and that we still are living in despite current setbacks, if you wish, we're still living in a world that is globalizing, the growth of trade, the growth of cross-border capital flows. These are higher than the growth of world output. And so a city that's specializing in the services that facilitate these industries should, in fact, be growing itself faster than world output. So that's part of the reason why this gap relative to the rest of the UK is widening out. It may simply be because, you know, you can't build the houses here, you can't build the office blocks, you can, I suppose, but it's difficult getting all of it's crammed into this small space so that the prices rise and the wages rise, and so on. Before it gets too gloomy, let me just say, I pointed out that the financial sector has had a difficult time the last 5 years. But last year saw phenomenal growth in business service employment overall in London. It's been a very, we all know in this room, the last 18 months, 2 years has been a boom period for London. And there you see it, huge rise, a 10% rise in business service employment last year. That wasn't financial, it was the other sectors. It's very much these miscellaneous things like lawyers, accountants, digital media, you know, a whole, it may be to some extent that London is reinventing itself. Okay, you've just about heard enough from me, so I'll just leave you with that, you know, look, you can guess my views about these two debates, okay. But you may have your own views. What I'd say is that obviously there is a big debate about whether we should rebalance our economy. In my view, we want to be focusing on these areas that have done us very well in the last, well, the 20 years up to 2008. We want to be in control of these things ourselves. We don't want the European Union to control them. We want to be controlling them ourselves as we were before when we were successful. Within London itself, there are major issues about whether somehow, what is going on is somehow London's reinventing itself as these new industries take over from, I'm afraid, the stagnating financial sector, stagnating in my view. Yeah, there's been a global recession, but also stagnating because of excessive and unnecessary e-regulation. We must get that regulation back within our own control, back within this country. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gerard Lyons, the Chief Economic Advisor to Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. Dr. Lyons is the former Chief Economist of Standard Chartered Bank and Swiss Bank Corporation. He has been awarded top forecaster by the Sunday Times and has been ranked by Bloomberg as the #1 global forecaster in 2010 and 2011. In 1999, he opposed the UK adopting the euro, predicting that the combined currency would run into trouble. In August of this year, he produced a report entitled Win-Win, comparing over 20 years the benefits of staying in a reformed European Union compared to the UK leaving and pursuing a reform-led outward-looking, open economic policy. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gerard Lyons.
Good evening. It's a great honour, great pleasure to be here this evening, and it's fantastic to be able to follow Tim on the podium. And I had the pleasure and honour of also reading his report, actually just as we were producing this report at City Hall, and I managed to refer to one or two things in this report that Boris unveiled here in early August. I could just stand here and basically repeat everything Tim has said. You might find that interesting, but you probably would prefer I didn't do that. Let me look at this in three different ways. One, just some comments about the financial sector in relation to London. Second, about the economic issues and link that into the Europe report that has just been mentioned. And then third and finally, the whole issue of reform and our relationship with Europe in the future. Basically, my thinking is that the UK's best prospects are to be in a reformed European Union. But a key part of this Europe report released by the Mayor was that we felt, and we had longer-term economic forecasts done by an outside group, we felt that being outside of Europe was better than being in an unreformed European Union, which maybe was controversial for some people. But let me just follow on first from what Tim was saying. London is 22.5% of the UK economy. Indeed, its importance is even greater than that. The European Commission, which has already been mentioned, last year carried out a report outlining the most competitive regions in Europe. Interestingly, 3 of the top 5 are in the south of England. In 5th place, Surrey and Sussex. 3rd place, not often mentioned, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire and Oxfordshire. And in 2nd place, London. Interestingly enough, Utrecht and around there were seen as the most competitive region. But 3 of the top 5 regions in Europe that are most competitive are in the south of England. And basically, London was a key factor. London is both a diversified and a specialised economy, if that's not too oxymoronic. Diversified, tech, biomed, lots of different areas, creative arts, culture, but specialised in the sense that the financial and insurance sector accounts for just under 1/5 of the London economy. According to City UK, when you look at London's financial sector in relation to the rest of Europe, Europe has strong national financial centres in Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Frankfurt and Paris, strong niche centres in Geneva and Zurich, offshore centres in Dublin, Guernsey, Jersey and Luxembourg, and emerging centres in Istanbul, and people used to say Moscow, but I don't think they say that anymore. None, importantly, rival London. London is Europe's only global financial centre. Our competition is not so much within Europe, it's global. It's with the likes of Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, even Dubai, you name other centres. They might not necessarily have the sheer scale of London, but they have the ability to compete in other niche areas, global areas in the future. We had a major financial crisis, but outside of the banking sector, many parts of the city did pretty well. Indeed, according to Deloitte at the beginning of this year, if one looks at global knowledge-based industries, the number of high-skilled knowledge-based jobs in the top 5 centres globally are not just in financial centres. In fact, in 5th place globally was Boston, 425,000. 4th place, Hong Kong, 630,000. 3rd place, LA, 784,000. 2nd place, New York, 1.2 million. And London, top of the tree, 1.5 million. Indeed, as Tim has mentioned, London is the biggest, or the UK is the biggest exporter of financial services. In 2013, it was 71 billion. America was 27 billion. Luxembourg, 22 billion. London has done well for a whole host of reasons. It's been responsive. Indeed, even in the last few years, we've seen London and the UK position itself in new growth markets. The Mayor played a big role last year, making sure that for the first time ever, the World Islamic Finance Conference took place outside in an Islamic country, took place in London. The RMB market outside of mainland China is now growing in London. And indeed, on his prime ministerial trip to China at the end of last year, Basically, David Cameron had a half a day focusing on the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, what it means and the role London and the UK can play. So we are basically positioning ourselves, but there are risks. And Tim's analysis really highlighted many of the risks. He touched on the three big supervision areas. On top of that, I would also highlight the fact that qualified majority voting prevents the United Kingdom from protecting the city in a way in which maybe the French, for instance, can protect the agricultural sector. Moreover, what's happening is being described as intrusive and detailed control of national laws and markets. Why? Because once the qualified majority voting takes place, the ECJ then ensures interpretation and enforcement. On top of that, a big worry around the city is not only about our relationship with Europe, whether we're in or out, but I tell you, speaking to many people in the city over the last 18 months, there is equal concern about the relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone, even if the UK remains in the EU. Of course, London suffers from excessive domestic regulation as the regulatory pendulum has swung from one extreme to the other. But it's basically not all down to Europe, but many of the problems we're likely to face in the future are European linked. But to conclude the first part, the city's relationship with Europe cannot only be seen through regulatory and legislation eyes. It also needs to be seen in economic terms as well. And hence this report that came out from the Mayor's office, I think, is important. Let me briefly take you back 63 years, 1951. Then the desire was to avoid another war. Then Europe was dependent on US martial aid. We were at the early stages of the Cold War, and Clement Attlee was our Prime Minister. That was the environment in which 6 countries, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands and West Germany, signed the Treaty of Paris and established the European Coal and Steel Community, allowing a common market in iron and steel. It was the forerunner of the European Union. 6 years later, in 1957, the often quoted Treaty of Rome was signed. There has been no turning back since. This is the basis of the economic model that has driven Europe since. Ask yourself, is this the economic model for the future? A world in which the world economy, despite Western problems, has continued to grow. $62 trillion was the size of the world economy the evening Lehman Brothers went bust. $74 trillion was the size of the world economy at the beginning of this year. In nominal terms, some of that is inflation. The vast bulk is real economic activity. Despite the biggest financial crisis, the world has continued to grow. The emergence of China. 1 in 12 people in the world is an Indian under 27. 2/3 of global growth in the next 20 years is expected to come from the top 600 cities. But in the next 20 years, the Western world, currently which has 157 cities in the top 600, is then expected to have only 20. Europe's share of the world economy will shrink. Importantly, London should still be a global city, but importantly, the UK's population in 25 years' time is likely to be bigger than that of Germany's. If we make just some inroads into our productivity gap, contrary to what people believe, the UK will overtake Germany as the biggest economy in Western Europe. That's the global, longer-term picture we need to be thinking about. It's how we position Europe, the UK, and London in this growing global economy. Now, if we were to leave the EU, there would be major disruption. Hence, it's important to make sure that when you make a comparison, it's not over a 2, 3, 4 year period. The legal and financial complexity of leaving is immense. There was a great study by Clifford Chance and City UK earlier this year, which I would recommend to you, that looked at this in detail. Therefore, if you're to look at the economic comparison between Britain in Europe and Britain outside, you need to have a 20-year time horizon. 20 years to get over that shock if you decided to leave, and look at the ups and downs through 2 economic cycles. We commissioned Volterra, an independent forecasting group, to do some analysis. And that basically came up with the view that our best outcome is to be in a reformed EU, but it's a pretty close call in second place to be outside. And a distant third was to stay in an unreformed European Union. That leads on to the third and final point, reform and our relationship. Look, no one should underestimate the challenge of trying to reform the EU. No one should kid themselves about the challenges if the UK decided to leave the EU. But if we were to seek reform, what sort of reforms should we be trying to achieve? In some respects, it's a mindset change. And you could argue this is already happening across parts of the European Union. It's about making Europe, including the UK, innovative, productive, outward-looking. It's about trying to address that relationship between the EZ and the non-EZ, the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone. France protects its agricultural sector because of the Luxembourg Compromise, which was signed in January 1966. It basically allows France to make sure that nothing disadvantageous is implemented against its agricultural sector. Maybe we need something like that for the financial sector here in London, but certainly we need to iron out the future relationship between the Eurozone and non-Eurozone. The single market in services, it doesn't work, it should. In people, it needs to continue to work, but linked to making sure that benefit systems don't allow benefit migrants. 1 in 8 people in London's financial sector are from Europeans from outside the UK. In fact, if you look at London's construction sector, it's 1 in 4, and in the food and retail sector, it's also 1 in 4. So London benefits from having a single market in services and a single market in people. And also, finally, in terms of reforms, we need to establish the supremacy of UK courts in non-single market related rulings. In terms of the relationship, look, is Europe a prison or is it a castle? Is it a prison where people are trapped inside, in which case you don't really want to be in it? Or is it a castle, a beacon of strength in a changing, growing global economy? I think if we can start to reform Europe, that's a win. But if we can't, we should rest assured in the confidence that being outside, pursuing sensible policies and having a good relationship is also a win. So coming back to Tim's report, I think the City of London is vital, not just for the London economy, but for the UK economy. Also, the City of London is Europe's financial centre and it's Europe's financial sector. So we need to make sure that the relationship really puts not just London, not just single market, but plays a key role in looking at the city directly itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gerard, for that. Ladies and gentlemen, I now wish to introduce Lars Christensen. I believe that Lars has never worked as an economist, but he brings immense experience as a practitioner in global financial markets. Lars is the co-founder and chief executive of Saxo Bank. Under his leadership, Saxo Bank has become a global force and is present in over 25 cities across the world. Many of those financial centres that Gerard has just mentioned, including London, Zurich, Singapore, Hong Kong and Dubai. Saxo Bank specialises in online trading and investment across financial markets. It enables investors to trade foreign exchange, contracts for differences, futures, options and derivative products on international markets. Ladies and gentlemen, Lars Christensen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. Let me start by also saying thank you to Bloomberg, with whom we have an excellent working relationship in Saxo Bank. And they should be highly commended for always generating debate and thought leadership. And of course, thank you very much to the Bruges Group for having me here again. I consider it an honor to speak to this group of people, because I highly value the work that is done by the think tank to challenge, to question and to report honestly on the European Union that today sadly has developed into possibly the greatest threat to freedom, not just for the city, but for any business and for any Europeans in all walks of life and in all aspects of their lives. I think many fail to see the risks and the disturbing underlying agenda, and sometimes I wonder if I'm being overly sensitive to the excesses of the EU, but reading your report, Professor Congdon, I know that I'm in good company. Now, you've heard two highly esteemed economists here. I'm not an economist, so I'll try to give a slightly more personal and broader perspective on this debate, because I think this is about even more than just the city. The city is a very important part of it. The UK financial industry is a very important part of this discussion, but it is a symptom of an even greater malaise, unfortunately. For me, the city and its financial industry has always been something very special. And to illustrate this, I'd like to briefly tell you a story that goes back more than 25 years, when I was a young man aspiring for a career in the financial industry. And at that time, for me, the only place in the world to start a career in the financial industry was the city. So I went here with a couple of £100 in my pocket and got a flat share and went around and tried to sell my relatively limited competences at that point in time. The second broker I asked in London, and to whom I presented a very rudimentary business plan for building a client base, the second broker I asked actually accepted me in spite of my limited experience. And I remain very grateful to the persons that did that for giving me that first crucially important chance. And I'm not sure that would have happened many other places than the City of London. The salaries in those days was not very high for a rookie, but for me it was not at all about the money. It was a chance for me to get a foothold in the heart of the financial industry. So please don't tell my wife, but even before I met her in London a few years later, I was already in love, because I was in love with the city, and I'm still in love with the city. This is a place where a foreign, inexperienced young man could start an exciting career just based on desire and ambition and willingness to learn fast. And a place that generously, without prejudice, meritocratically offered an invaluable start for a future would-be entrepreneur to learn the ropes and gather courage to eventually start his own financial business. And that is what I personally love about the city. Now, you can call me old-fashioned, but I take it very personally when my loved ones are threatened and harassed. And this also goes for the city. And make no mistake, the city is under attack at this time. Not from smarter competitors, not from locations with better infrastructures or stronger business frameworks. No, it's under attack from faceless bureaucrats in other countries that do not even fully understand what the city does or how it functions, although they indirectly benefit from the achievements of the city every day of their lives. The city is under attack from state-loving politicians that hate our way of life, that hate free markets, that wants to control everyone's life, and have no concern for the consequences, even if it means reduced growth and less wealth, not just for the successful and accomplished business people, but also, in spite of it, meaning poverty and social unrest and suffering for the less fortunate in society. Their political ambitions and desire for power far exceeding their capabilities and their intellect, but they have no respect for competence, for skills, for specialization or value creation. And simply put, financial markets, with their rationality, with them actually metering out consequence for actions, be they smart actions or stupid actions, it has consequences in financial markets. Financial markets stand in the way of these people. And the City of London is the foremost representative and symbol of these rational financial markets. So logically, it must be restricted, it must be controlled, it must be overtaxed, and frankly, if possible, it must be annihilated. So this is not just about people trying to grab control of the regulation of the City of London. This is about government control in general versus free markets. This is about dirigism versus laissez-faire. This is about the state versus individual achievement. It's ultimately about totalitarianism versus freedom. And pursuing free markets, creating financial progress, freedom, and individual achievement is really the hallmark of what is good about the financial industry. But as was pointed out, far from everyone think that these objectives are desirable. So let me repeat, make no mistake, the city is under attack, not just for its business and its money, but for everything that it represents in this world. The fact that the city is actually England's smallest county by area, but employs over 700,000 people, is a testament to the importance and prosperity of not just the city, but London, as very eloquently explained, as a giant in the financial world. The city is the world's leading exporter of financial services, and the value, as we've already heard, of the UK trade surplus in financial services and business services is more than double that of the next largest countries, including the US, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. The city is the beating heart of Europe's financial center. It takes no heart surgeon to recognize that if you stop the blood supply to that heart, you black out, and eventually the patient, not just the city, but the whole of the economy of the UK and Europe, for that matter, will die. So I read your report with great interest. It shows that international financial services, in which the UK has always excelled, are in retreat and remain particularly at risk because of the EU. And I must say, this trend is not likely to be reversed unless the British government fully recovers the power to set the rules for the financial sector. As the report correctly shows, it is no secret that key policy-making individuals in Germany, in France, in other continental European countries have long very much disliked the financial services industry. They resent the UK's past and present success in these activities. There's, in my mind, as I think you also point out in your paper, there's no doubt that the euro was created partially as a means of shifting Europe's financial center of gravity away from London to mainland Europe. Since that creation of the euro, it has so indisputably shown its true colors that anyone with a rational view of the world knows that the common currency has been a historic failure of giant proportions. There's one thing, and only one thing, that can save and rescue the euro at this point. And let me be very clear, that will not rescue Europe, quite the opposite. It will only rescue the euro, but this in itself has become an ideological imperative among its religious following. That one thing that can save the euro is a much, much more extensive integration between the euro countries, a common financial policy, common debt issuance, a willingness to make enormous transfer payments from the wealthier to the poorer countries, and a suppression of the natural efficiency of the markets so that this insane political project can survive. The countries that have wisely decided to stay outside of the euro, including the UK and my own home country, Denmark, those countries are seen as enemies of the grandiose German-French scheme of a European superstate. They and their financial markets must be controlled at all costs. They must be taxed, they must be burdened with not their own problems, but the self-inflicted damage suffered by the euro adopters. Because these adopters of the euro cannot themselves, they cannot and they will not pay the bills for their folly, but they look very greedily towards the pockets of UK and Scandinavian taxpayers and businesses to pay for their mistakes. The latest big danger for our industry is the banking union. Undoubtedly, this will lead to healthy banks in Northern Europe getting lumbered with the bills of unhealthy banks in the Eurozone, eventually bringing, at worst, the entire European banking sector to its knees. With balance sheets stuffed full of dubious sovereign paper issued to cover the excesses of spendthrift politicians, we have not yet seen the full scale of this crisis that we are in and still stand in front of the worst. It will get much worse, in my opinion, unfortunately. And fortune will favor only the brave that retain control over their own national destiny. The rest will drag each other down with certainty. Leaving matters to Brussels with undemocratic, faceless bureaucrats, its Soviet-style rhetoric and empty symbols, its lack of competence and leadership, will lead to disaster for the city if the UK does not regain its powers to liberate and reinforce the free markets and the capitalism that created all of the wealth and prosperity that we all benefit from today. And you should be very aware that the EU never stops. The EU never rolls anything back. In a normal electorate, you would have changing governments. You might roll back the excesses of the prior government or vice versa. But the EU never rolls anything back. It just continues to amass more and more control in all areas. The EU has no self-criticism. It has no regrets, no matter how much or how often it fails. It just continues the rollout of its own powers, and it will continue to do that until someone says, enough is enough, until somebody says stop. And the time to say stop came a long time ago. In just a few weeks' time, we will celebrate the 25-year anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Back then, in 1989, who could have imagined that just 25 years later, we would have forgotten about capitalism's victory? We would have forgotten about the dangers and the failure of supranational government and control. We would have forgotten the absolute bankruptcy of socialism, and we would have forgotten the importance of competition and efficient capital allocation and specialization. Yet, here we are, with the EU repeating the failed experiments of the past. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's high time to say stop before it's too late and you won't even have a voice with which to say stop. Enough really is more than enough. I sincerely hope that your Prime Minister intends to do this after the next election. We know that the British people agree with their Prime Minister that any ideology that claims to be bigger than the nation state fundamentally denies human nature, and I think we should try to hold Mr. Cameron to that. For me, the UK saying stop is the biggest hope for Europe's future, the biggest hope for the real Europe of history and diverse cultures and different skills, competitive spirit, traditional freedom. And certainly, I can assure you that I will do anything to ensure in my own country, Denmark, that if you should choose that route, we should follow along. But it is clearly outside the Eurozone, has to be the only major nation outside of the Eurozone that drives this process. And I sincerely hope that, as a minimum, a very strong reform of the EU, which I personally doubt can be done, or simply leaving it and setting up a viable alternative, which I think will very quickly outcompete the Eurozone. To finish off, a long time ago, before I went into the financial industry, I actually wanted to be an archaeologist. And I'm still a great fan of history and was at the time. And like most Danish boys, we were particularly fascinated by the Vikings for obvious reasons. King William I, usually known as William the Conqueror, was a descendant of Viking raiders. And he launched the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Following the Battle of Hastings, he marched on to London. But when he came to London, he failed to get across London Bridge, and he failed to actually defeat the Londoners. Eventually, he crossed the River Thames at a different place and raiding the land as he went along and lastly winning the war. Except for the City of London, he had to grant the citizens of London a special charter in 1075. And that charter is a great example of London retaining its authority at difficult times and under attack. So it's time to draft a new charter demanding the authority back from the EU. In respect of the Bruges Group history, and on that note, I think it's worth remembering what a sound and rational vision of the EU looks like. And let's recall what Baroness Thatcher said in her speech at the College of Europe in Bruges on the 20th of September 1988. She said, "What we need now is to take decisions on the next steps forward rather than let ourselves be distracted by utopian goals. Utopia never comes because we know we should not like it if it did. Let Europe be a family of nations, understanding each other better, appreciating each other more, doing more together, but relishing our national identity no less than our common European endeavor. Let's have a Europe which plays its full part in the wider world, a Europe that looks outward, not inward, and which preserves the Atlantic community, which is our noblest inheritance and greatest strength." Those were the words of Baroness Thatcher a little more than 26 years ago this evening. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to say stop to the current and continuous power grab from Brussels. And I think if the people of the City of London and the people in this room should not have an incentive to say stop, who else has? So it's for the city, it's for for people in this room and for people of this opinion to actually start doing something about it. So thank you very much, everyone, for having me here.
Well, thank you very much, Lars, for those truly inspirational words. Now we've got an opportunity for a few questions for our guest speakers. Can I take the gentleman on the gangway there, please? Yes, you, sir. Yes? Yes, you. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
No microphone. There's obviously a difference of opinion about the possibility of renegotiating powers back to the UK. And in the context of this evening's subject, what's the minimum list that the panel would require back?
Gerard, would you like to start off with that one?
Yeah, in case people didn't hear the question, because the gentleman didn't have a microphone, is there, or what is the minimum list of what we would like back in the UK? I should say, I will give you my personal view, so nothing to do with the Mayor of London, but I think it's important maybe not to have a sort of red line. As we've seen, red lines can sometimes be misinterpreted, but I think what I outlined in this report, the Europe report, the win-win situation, which you can download from City Hall, we had an 8-point agenda for reform. But really, in my comments tonight, I outlined what I think are 4 key reforms. One was a generic one in terms of the mindset change about making Europe more outward-looking. You could argue that's very much linked to the competencies issue that's currently being discussed about where control should lie with national governments versus Europe. So that's one. 2 would be the whole relationship between the Eurozone and non-Eurozone, and basically safeguarding countries that have said that they will not join the Euro. At the moment, there is a sort of dual majority, but basically when that goes below 4, it stops. And you could argue that it's not clear how things will evolve in the future. The single market needs to work properly, particularly in financial services, you could argue. It works in terms of the wholesale market, but not retail market. And then the 4th, the whole jurisdiction in terms of the legal jurisdiction, something that Tim touches on in his pamphlet. I would say they're the most desirable. So I wouldn't answer it in saying they're the minimum, but I would answer it in saying they're the most desirable.
I asked the question about minimum, is that waffling things like that means that it's impossible to detect what constitutes success. You've got to have some measure to say.
Well, you can use the word waffling if you want.
Just use it to waffle.
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, you've got to be realistic about what's achievable. And you can throw your toys out and everyone else can sort of go off and do other things. But you actually need to get the whole thing moving in the right direction. But as my colleague on the podium has pointed out, and as I touched on, when you actually look at the underlying growth drivers in Europe, it's very difficult to change the mindset. Ever closer union is a key aspect of this in terms of the continent. David Heathcote-Emery wrote a very good book where he talked about it being like an escalator. So you can call it waffling if you want to call it, but I call it as realistic things that we should be aiming for at the very least.
Tim.
Okay.
In his speech, was it in this room? I don't know. In his speech in January 2013,
yeah.
David Cameron said that national parliaments were and should remain the source of democratic accountability and legitimacy and so on in the European Union and in all European nations. I'm sorry, Parliament, again, to be sovereign in Britain, there is only one answer. You have basically to unravel all of this stuff that's happened in Europe, really since the Single European Act, actually, that's really what's always treated since then, or else leave. And as far as I'm concerned, there isn't going to be any serious renegotiation of this kind, and talking about a minimum, as you kind of imply, is a complete waste of time. We should just leave, and that's that.
Lars, have you any comment on this one?
Yeah, I would like to think what you think, that it could be reformed, but I think I probably have to end up with your conclusion. But what we would need in terms of reform, just as a theoretical exercise. Is certainly, I do not believe in a scenario where banking is very difficult to see through, very transparent, very different in different countries, very different problem sets. I do not believe that an international regulator can have any chance of having an understanding of a local banking system, for example. So I believe the regulation should be national, should be based on best practice, which incidentally comes out of the UK mostly, and in our country we have largely modeled ourselves on UK regulation, as many other new jurisdictions have tried to a large extent. Secondly, we should at all costs avoid any possibility that the European Commission and the Brussels can begin to collect direct taxes, which is what the financial transaction tax is about. Their hope is that a large proponent of this tax would go to their own budget so that they can do even more harm, which we should not underestimate. That's one of the reasons that they want them through there, because they kind of imagine a lot of the proceeds will go directly to themselves, right? Thirdly, the whole idea of banks across Europe having solidaric responsibility for each other is completely self-defeating. You know, imagine if, I don't know what kind of businesses you run, but imagine if you're a greengrocer or a plumber or whatever, and you had the responsibility for every other greengrocer in the country, or every other plumber. If you outcompeted your local plumber in your village, you know, you would have to pay for his default. I mean, it's a completely insane system, which gives no encouragement to competition, and of course brings down the strong while not really benefiting the weak. We know that very specifically because Denmark is actually, to my belief, the only country in the world that has fully implemented that system. So the Danish taxpayer has not had one single Danish crown out of his pocket in order to recapitalize the Danish banking system. There has been given some guarantees, which in theory could have led to taxpayers paying. But every penny that has been paid to banks that lost money or went under has been paid by other banks. I have a very small bank, but I've had the pleasure of personally, not as a big shareholder, this has cost me nearly £10 million over the last 4 years, and I'm absolutely sure that those £10 million would have been a lot healthier building jobs and building growth and building better products for our clients in Saxo Bank. But nevertheless, we, even as a very small organization, have spent £25 million on supporting banks that we had nothing to do with, that went under because of a different business model and poor regulatory oversight, etc. And that we definitely need to not spread to a global European level. If we have to now have the great banks of England and Denmark to pay for faltering banks in Southern Europe, that's going to be catastrophe and bring everybody down. So we need at least to deal with those issues inside this. At the end of the day, do I truly believe that can be done? No, which is why I tend to go with you, that probably the best thing is to leave. I do not think that's an option for Denmark to go it alone and leave the EU, because I think we will be subject to blackmail and making an example because we're a small, unimportant country. So I think we will have a very difficult life if we left. But I do think the UK could do it, and I do think that others should follow suit if that was an option.
Can I just very, very quickly, just Gerard, your answer was very diplomatic and excellent. However, it seems to me that the minimum must mean that, I mean, I want us out, okay, it's clear. But, you know, from yours, if you're going to renegotiate, one thing must be the minimum is we do not have the financial transactions tax in this country. That must be absolutely categoric. Yeah. And if I see that, then I've given up already on, never mind.
Actually, in terms of, I was just going to say, in terms of the Europe report, I got heavily criticised from many people for being too critical of Europe. But in the report, can I just state something? This is on the introduction page. The UK can only achieve serious reform if it is serious about leaving. And it can only be serious about leaving if it believes this is better than the status quo of staying in an unreformed EU. It is.
Thanks. I'll take a question from my former colleague, Bill Cash. Bill.
Thank you very much. Can I just say, first of all, that I agree with everything that's been said from the panel, so I don't need to repeat any of that. I do, however, have one very serious problem with the way in which it's been going. I've been in Parliament now 30 years, and at least 29 of those have been devoted to trying to sort out what I feared was what was going to happen. And Barry and I were involved in the rebellion against the Maastricht Treaty, which was the first really big stand against what was going on for all the reasons that have now become apparent. But much more recently, I wrote a letter to the Financial Times in 2009, and the people who know most about these things will recall the de la Rosière report, and it was perfectly obvious to me at that stage that this was going to lead to majority voting and to all the things that have just been described by the panelists. I wrote a letter, and actually, I didn't bring it for this meeting, actually. It was for another reason. But I said in that letter in 2009, we need to insist on the supremacy of Westminster legislation overriding such European lawmaking. That was about the whole of the regime, regulatory regime, the jurisdiction, the majority voting, and the impact that it would have on our direct national interest. Now, the point is, and this is what really troubles me, there it is, it's happened, but as so often, people didn't listen. The City of London establishment did not listen. That is part of the problem. And I want to be quite clear about that, because I'm now being elected as chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee, unanimously in the House of Commons. And there are reasons for that. And they are because, for example, we produced a report last November on the whole question of the relationship between national parliaments, to go to Tim's point, and quoting the Bloomberg speech, and the root of our democracy, because that is the key question. What do people actually want? And in that report, which was unanimous, we concluded that you have to, and this is a select committee of the House of Commons, having taken evidence for about a year. And we said that you will have to repeal legislation unilaterally at Westminster, which is not in our national interest, and you will also have to veto legislation which is in the pipeline, which is clearly not in national interest. So I'll give you the ports regulation as one that's going on at the moment, just an example. But the point that I want to make is this, that you are all right, absolutely correct. The problem is that we're not given the opportunity, except by meetings of this kind, to be able to actually get our message across. The BBC relentlessly prevents the kind of discussion that is needed to get to the bottom of what is going on. And I've challenged, in fact, I have summoned the BBC Trust to come to explain BBC's position in relation to the manner in which they treat the European issue. And in fact, that report, and I'll conclude at this point because I think I've made my point clear, we are absolutely determined, and we concluded effectively that we would have to leave the treaties because you're quite right. There is no chance whatever, looking at Mr. Juncker, or indeed a paper the European Foundation has just published today on the role of Lord Hill and how he's got a poison chalice, in other words. He's trapped by the legislation that's been created. You can't unravel it just by being made a commissioner. But that report, and I'll conclude on this point, actually was supported by over 100 MPs overtly calling for unilateral repeal and veto. And in fact, what happened was that the government has refused to accept it, but the number of people who agree with it, I would estimate to be well over 200 within the Conservative Party alone. So the bottom line is this. We can have these meetings. I'm very, very keen on the Bruges Group, and if I may say, on its chairman and its staff and everything that goes with it. I founded the Friends of Bruges Group in 1988-89 with Barry, as it happens, in the House of Commons. But what I am saying to you, in a nutshell, is that the battle is on, and we are not going to give up, because it's not just the City of London, absolutely vital as that is for all the reasons that have been given. It extends into virtually every area of our national life. We cannot make the changes unless we leave the treaties. The only question is this: how do you do it? You have to have a majority of votes in the House of Commons to achieve it. That's why I'm committed to the Conservative Party achieving that objective, but I recognise the fact that we have been fighting a battle which we're going to have to win. But I hope that Gerard Lyons, with his influence with Boris Johnson, will give us the opportunity to continue with that. Sorry for making a speech, but actually the fact is it needs to be made, because the problem, as we heard from the Julius Caesar, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you for that magnificent overview. I wasn't actually in the House of Commons in 1989. I didn't come along till 92. But apart from that, I agree with everything you say. Gerard, would you like to comment at all on what Bill has just put to us?
Well, I can't really add much to that. I remember it's interesting as he was saying how the debate moves on and some things don't change and some things do change. I remember in 1997 writing a column in the Financial Times, and the reason I'd written this piece and they thought it was very outrageous comment, so they said write it as a column. And I was saying that the only way the euro would survive is if it became a political union. And that's basically, I think most people in this room, judging from the audience, would probably agree with that. But it's interesting, over time, things that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people thought were not centre stage have become centre stage. I think what Mr. Cash has touched on, over time, more and more things that people like the Bruges Group say are being proven to be right. So therefore, I do think that the issues that he's touched on are key.
Tim, quickly.
I just say that before this event, I gave an interview to the BBC, about the pamphlet. So one shouldn't be too bit by bit public opinion moves. I do agree with Bill, though, that many people don't realise what's happened, and this is, and Bill, you've been brilliant because you've seen it all the way through. I remember 2005 when you had the votes against the European Constitution in both France and the Netherlands, and I said, okay, this is it for my lifetime. I don't need to worry about this. The European integration is going to stop here. And you said, no, they'll just carry on like a bulldozer. They couldn't care less. You were absolutely right, and regardless of the democratic decisions that have come from France and the Netherlands. Many people don't understand what's happened, and it's going to be a huge challenge for us to get over what's. It's complicated. You have to explain the stuff about qualified majority voting and the Council of Ministers and these directives and regulations and the decisions, the decisions, capital D, taken by the Commission. And this stuff, people, their eyes just glaze. They're not interested. They want to move on. You have to tell them that their country's been stolen from them, then they start to understand.
Thank you. OK, I'll take a question from the gentleman on the front row there, and also the gentleman just along. We'll take two together. Yes, this one first.
Roger Kendrick. We might get a referendum in 2017, and if we do, I think the challenge is going to be to win it, as Tim's just said. And I think we've seen with Scotland that people don't tend to vote for a change, and we saw it in the AV referendum. So we've got an uphill struggle, and we've got the whole establishment believes in this monstrosity that we've been talking about tonight. So if there is a vote, I think we have to have a clear alternative that people can vote for. They didn't have that in Scotland. And one of the things I'd like to put on the table is the agreement that has been reached between Canada and the European Union. It hasn't been ratified yet, but it is a more or less simple, straightforward trade agreement with a certain amount of constraint, but not very many. And what I'm suggesting is that we need something simple that another Anglo-Saxon country has done that people might believe in, so we don't have to get involved in all the complications that Tim has just described.
Thank you very much. And the question from the second gentleman there, please.
Hi there.
Would you agree?
Hi, Sean Howlett. We keep seeing very destructive moves from the European Union against financial services coming out, such as ESMA and MiFID. Why do you think such blatantly destructive moves keep coming out of Europe? What do you think the motives are for this? Are they just stupid?
Gerard, what do you think on that latter point?
Well, on the latter point, I would say later you'll have a great chance to read Tim's document because I think it just answers all those questions. Actually, one point that was made to me in Brussels was they said, look, or someone said, look, when things go wrong in your financial sector, it impacts us all, so we have to control it. So if you're looking for a logical explanations, that aspect might come through. So therefore, you could say here in the UK, having sensible regulation in place to make sure the financial sector is controlled properly is important. But coming back to Tim's point, it's about domestic regulation can address that. So I'm trying to imagine if someone from Brussels was here. But yeah, but it's about, yeah. But I think what we've been saying tonight is about positioning Europe, the UK, London, whichever you want to look at it, in the changing global economy. And I don't fear leaving at all. Basically, if we don't, my view is that if you don't achieve the reform, then we should not be afraid of leaving. But the challenge is, the first question from Roger, is that there is this status quo bias. People fear the unknown. They think there's safety in numbers. There's this argument that Britain won't be able to do free trade deals, which is complete nonsense. In fact, if you actually look at it, you could say that we're encumbered by having to negotiate with a whole bloc where many of the things different countries want are not things in our best interests. We could actually have free trade deals like Canada, etc. We could easily repeat some of the European free trade deals. We could easily cut some new trade deals. There will be complications in other areas repeating all the 33 free trade deals that Europe has. But the point is that when we're pursuing our free trade deals from our own perspective, it's actually quite an iterative process. We can decide what's best interest for Britain and do the bilateral deals. So I think what we need to get across to people is that the alternative is better. People do fear the unknown. And I remember in the No campaign, I might have the figures wrong, but the rule of thumb, the research then 20 years ago, was that you needed to have a 14-point gap in your favour to get people to change. Like opinion poll, there is something like that. So it never seemed likely that Scotland would vote yes, shall we say, given the way the opinion polls were going. But you really need to set out the case. But just to conclude, what I find interesting is I remember being involved in the No campaign, and the first time we did a big event in the city, it was over at Fleming's City HQ. There's about 200 people there, the great and the good of the city, and they were so in favour of the euro. They were so anti the sentiment on the panel. But the important thing is those guys were won over by having a clear, concise, constructive argument and a vision. And I think you're right in your question about the benefits from Canada, but also you're right in your question about we shouldn't underestimate the challenges involved in this whole process.
Lars, how do you feel, from your Danish perspective, we can overcome that fear of change? Because Denmark was a country that voted against Maastricht on a referendum and then flipped back.
Yeah, well, I think just coming back to the earlier comments around people not paying attention and people not really being interested in this, that is a major problem. And I mean, there's no doubt in the Danish public debate, 80%, if not more, is around domestic issues. That obviously also shows that people are more interested in their own country than the EU. Whereas on the other hand, what they fail to realize is that at least 80% of the laws are being made in the EU. So actually, that domestic debate is completely irrelevant. You know, we can have all the ideas about how to reform our own country, but we're not actually in a position to do it unless we deal with the enormous influx of laws from Brussels. The other thing I think is very important is that it's not just that people are not paying attention. It is that it is deliberately being made very, very difficult to understand what is actually going on. You know, things are being put into notes, documents are about 20 times longer than they have to be. So at the end of the day, nobody can keep an overview, even with the best of intentions. Former President Klaus, who I believe also has spoken here, who's a good friend of mine, told me that when they had to vote on the Treaty of Lisbon, it was not even translated to Czech. So they had to vote on a foreign language, very complicated treaty without having a translation in their own language, right? So these guys are deliberately making it very, very difficult to figure out what they're doing. And if you look back in history, actually some of them have been blatantly honest about the fact that we are trying to achieve this without anybody noticing.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's another part of the problem, that this is actually a non-democratic process where people are deliberately trying to not let people know what's going on, and that obviously doesn't help because it's not very interesting in the first place to the average voter. Finally, in terms of alternatives, I agree, but then again, we have to. I live in Switzerland. One of the reasons is I just can't stand the idea of living in the EU anymore, so I moved to Switzerland. I moved to Switzerland about 4 years ago because I was concerned about also that there might be much stronger exit protections for individuals, which actually, as a matter of fact, was introduced in my country less than 12 months later. So I got out at a very late point, and people in similar situations simply has had to give up leaving Denmark and the EU because of exit taxation rules that make it impossible to leave the country if you have a running business. Long story, but that's an economic Berlin Wall for entrepreneurs in my country. So I left, but when I look at Switzerland and I see the concern that business has down there about the arm twisting that Switzerland is under from the EU, or something that I also know a little bit about Norway. Norway basically has to implement about 80% of all EU legislation without even questioning it to have access to the market. So there isn't really an alternative if you want to be part of that market. It's a little bit of an illusion to think that you can escape EU legislation that way. So if there really was to be an alternative, again, I think we have to look to the UK's leadership, because as the most important nation outside of the Eurozone, it is the country that has to take this leadership. And I do think there could be an alternative, saying that the 10 non-Euro countries with a much closer collaboration, with a slightly different way of cooperating around this, could form a very powerful bloc that would make a serious counterpart to the Eurozone bloc. And there are, as far as I'm aware, sort of unofficial meetings in the non-Eurozone bloc between finance ministers and finance ministry officials from time to time, discussing how can we put up a common resistance to the Eurozone's demands. And I think that is probably the alternative that really has to be worked out, because I think if the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic countries that are not in, the UK obviously, working together with non-EU countries like Switzerland, like the US and Canada, etc., we could probably build a fairly credible alternative that would very quickly outcompete the Eurozone. And I think the Finns that are sitting as the only Eurozone member in our Scandinavia, they would feel very lonely up there if we actually had a working alternative. Would the Dutch want to be in there? Would the Germans even want to be in there if there was a workable alternative? And I think if you really want to create an alternative, that's probably the direction to look. And I think there's only one person that can really take the leadership in that process, and that's the Prime Minister of the UK.
Thank you.
Tim, very quickly on this, but one of the key architects of the European Union and the process of European integration was this chap, Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet believed in the Monnet method was step by step, very slowly, unobtrusively, in a complicated way that politicians wouldn't understand, that the democracy wouldn't understand, and he openly was against democracy. All right. It's all public record. He said these things openly in the 1940s, 1950s. He wanted a European integration to be organized by an international bureaucracy. That is what's happened. National parliaments aren't in control, contrary to what Mr. Cameron may think and want. I can just agree with you entirely. Can I just one very quickly? I find what you're saying about the fears of small countries being blackmailed, I mean, just so many historical echoes, and it's just so wrong.
Okay. I'll take a question from the gentleman right at the back by the glass wall there.
The City of London is meant to be very clever. It's meant to read the small print. Back in the 70s, EU referendum on membership, the City of London was all in favour of Britain joining the European Union. If London is so clever, why did they predict the current mess we're in against it?
Okay, and I'll take one more question from, yes, the gentleman on the gangway, halfway along. Yes, you, sir. Yes.
I'm in favour of having a referendum for EFTA like Norway has. I've got a couple of points or questions. You say that 80% Norway takes 80% of the regulations of the EU. I don't think that's correct. I think you mean the single market. There are 15,000 EU regulations which they and they divide by 4,500, and they have a backlog of about 500 which they're just taking their time over and they don't want to implement. In terms of actually solutions and actions, right, we need a referendum which we can win. And I agree with you about having alliances, the Nordic countries, Baltic countries, Austria, Switzerland. If they were to join EFTA, and I believe we need to choose, Britain needs to choose a referendum which not only Britain can win, but the other countries in Europe can win as well. So we can have an alliance, so we can basically stop this totalitarian mess continuing, certainly in our countries. And the EFTA single market is one of those which is off the shelf. It's not perfect, but it's a winnable referendum. It's a stepping stone. Norway has the veto, and it uses the veto, or basically it slows things down. So what would Gerard say? I would say, Gerard, if Britain was already in EFTA single market instead of EU single market, would you believe that Britain should join the EU?
Gerard, what?
Well, it's a hypothetical question, so I think, can I answer it in also the context of the first question? The gentleman at the back was talking about the referendum back in the 70s. Now, I was at school then, I haven't looked at all the ins and outs of it, but basically at that time, the feeling was Europe's growth model was delivering, and in economic terms, the UK had underperformed. Europe was performing very well. So there was the desire to grab that slice of that economic pie, shall we say. If you look at it in economic terms now, Europe's growth model clearly is disappointing. Now, if Britain was leaving, I think it's important to stress, the Mayor of London's view is that we should stay in a reformed EU and we should seek reform. I think it's also important to say that if the UK was serious about leaving, then I would imagine, in my own personal view, that Germany would reach over backwards to try and keep us in. So people do want us to be in. In some respects, you could argue the southern parts of Europe want the UK in to sort of counterbalance the northern Europeans. I would argue that the Germans would like the UK to stay in to counterbalance the French. The French, economically, I would argue, are in the periphery, politically are in the core. So they're caught somewhere in the middle. So the UK is in a strong position if it decides to push for reform. Also, it's been said to me that the UK doesn't engage enough within Europe. We don't really argue our case within Brussels, and we should engage more. Now, these are all valid points, and before you get to a referendum, these are all issues that really need to be addressed. Can you achieve reform? If you are asking for reform, come back to the first question, what reforms do you want? And then how do you play it from there? And then that comes on to the question that Roger asked, if you actually do get to a referendum, what's the alternative? Which is your question about EFTA. I don't think we necessarily need to be bound by what's already out there. In fact, Norway argued its case because it was assuming its people would vote to join the whole project. Britain is the 6th biggest economy in the world. We can actually be thinking globally if we're outside the EU. So I don't necessarily think I need to answer that question directly, as you say, but I would say that we do, coming back to the genesis of the question, certainly we need to be thinking globally and not just constrained by the continent.
You say, Gerard, that Germany wants Britain in the EU, but...
That would be my view,
yeah.
Yes.
How do you reconcile that with Angela Merkel's reaction when she came over here and she basically slapped down the whole idea of there being fundamental reform? The reforms that you and Boris want, they're off the table as far as she's concerned. How do you explain that?
I can't explain that, but when you look at any politician overseas, often what they say is aimed at their domestic audience, not just at the international audience. But Chancellor Merkel actually has, as we all know in this room, I'm sure, talked about the 7-25-50 problem. 7% population, 25% of global GDP, 50% of global benefit welfare spending in Europe. So if you look at what she said in the past, then she would clearly argue the case in those terms for reform. But come back to your question, yeah, look, I think it's about, at the end of the day, we in Britain can only control, or although Tim has pointed out we can't do this. But in terms of our argument, we can only control what we think we can achieve. And I think we need to be positioning ourselves, recognising all the constraints over there. But yeah, look, it's difficult to answer that question directly.
Okay. Tim, do you think EFTA is the answer?
EFTA may be maybe 30, 40 years ago, but not now. The Norway is a member of the European Economic Area. This is a difficult topic. The European Economic Area endorses the four freedoms: freedom of trade and capital flows, and but also freedom of movement of people. And I'm sorry, I don't agree with Britain. Britain must be able to control its borders. And that then means that we can't be in the European Economic Area, that Norway is not a model. Now, obviously, there's then Switzerland. Switzerland also had, until a few months ago, they had the European Economic Area in the sense of they're not in the EEA, but they got a part of the arrangement with the EU was that they had freedom of movement of people. The Swiss people voted by a very small margin against that. And there's some talk about, look, the example to me is indeed Canada. Canada and Australia. You know, they are countries much closer to us in terms of, you know, language, culture, law, and all the rest of it. Distance is neither here nor there. It's neither here nor there. And as you correctly said, you know, the EU has negotiated a free trade deal with Canada. They've respected Canada's independence. If they can do that with Canada, they can do that with us and respect our independence too. And then if people say, you know, that there's this horrible country and these people like me who want to reduce immigration, I say, look, I'd like us to be, you know, we're in these English-speaking countries that people want to come and live here because they're a nice place, they believe in freedom, all the rest of it. And we just want to be like Canada and Australia, and there's nothing, people don't criticize those countries, absolutely fine. We should do what they do. And they are a model, not Norway, not Sweden. Not Switzerland.
Do you want to, would you like to come in and comment on these issues?
Well, I just wanted to say about the 80%, maybe that's an exaggeration. That's been known to happen before. In fact, 80 is a bad number for me. I was touring just before the last presidential election. I was doing a lecture tour in the US, and I was on Fox News, and I astonished the interviewer by saying that I believe that upper middle income Danish family, when they paid all the taxes, there would actually be approximately 80% tax pressure, right? And I got slammed at home for, you know, spreading these lies. And a lot of people were saying it's got to be maximum 75 or 76%, right? So I will take back the 80%. But I do know from Norwegian business people and politicians that they do not feel a very extensive level of freedom vis-a-vis the EU. And I do know that the Swiss business community is also extremely concerned about the arm twisting they continuously experience, not least after the recent vote. So at the end of the day, I do not believe that really works in a big way. It's something more fundamental has to really happen than the Norwegian situation. And I still think if the real alternative here has got to be this sort of separate coalition of countries outside the Eurozone, extended into other countries that have a relatively respect for free markets and for free trade. I mean, if we have to look for some kind of solution, that's probably the more likely one. It was exactly Jean Monnet's quote. Actually, I was looking for. So I'm glad you remembered it. But those guys completely openly admitted that they were trying to hide the truth from the Europeans, right? And that's just what's going on here.
Okay, I'll take a couple of final questions because we're going to have to leave shortly. Gentleman just at the back there. Yes, you, sir.
Thank you. Would anyone on the panel like to comment on the Chancellor of the Exchequer and what he's been doing over the last 5 years in the context of discussion?
You mean what he's been doing vis-a-vis the European Union?
What has he been doing to try and support this city?
Okay, that's fine. And the final question here, because we're from the gentleman on the second row. Yes, sir. Yes.
I heard a wonderful saying the other day, which was perfect is the enemy of the good, and done is better than perfect. So what, in your opinion, are some quick wins that we can enact here that could possibly, if not reverse the direction of travel, at least slow it down, whilst we hope that there's some horse trading in Brussels?
Gerard, have you any quick wins, and do you want to comment on George Osborne?
These answers could go on for hours. In terms of the Chancellor, I think you need to understand the challenge facing any politician in the UK, in my view, which is that when we had the financial crisis, people blamed basically the city for what happened. And I think we've had really, I would say, three paradoxes in the last few years. We've had what Mervyn King called the economic paradox, which is a crisis caused by too much liquidity, low interest rates and too much debt, is being solved by even lower interest rates, even more liquidity and even more debt. So naturally the question is, how can that make sense? In terms of the city, I think we've had this regulatory paradox where individual pieces of regulation might seem to stand up by themselves, but when you add them all up, the sheer mass of them is just overwhelming. You could actually say it's like a regulatory pendulum. We've gone from one extreme where the general public thought regulation may have been too light, even though they didn't think like that, and we've gone to the other extreme like a pendulum swinging from one side to the other, and it's too heavy. And I think Europe is suffering from the balanced economy pendulum, that they're all, basically it's like if we all went to the bar after this too, and we all decided to keep our hands in our pocket and actually hands in our handbag, no one would actually have a drink. And Europe's like that. They're all basically keeping their hands in their pocket. They're not actually spending any money. There's a lack of demand, and they're basically forcing all the adjustment on the periphery countries. So in that context, the question about the Chancellor, it's a difficult one because I don't think he was in any sort of easy win situation. Ideally, I'd like to have seen, as I've said before, more spending on the infrastructure, but we are now seeing that, and that's good, so it takes time. The Mayor of London has actually outlined in the last couple of years some real good strategic papers about 2020 vision for London, about infrastructure spend on transport. We need to be building more housing. And the Europe report was about positioning London with respect to Europe. So I think all those are sensible. The last question, I'm not sure about the dull versus, that seemed to confuse me, but quick wins. I think Dumb. Dumb. Oh, I thought you, dumb. Oh, dumb. I thought you said dull. That's why I was confused. I think we need to be thinking global. The world economy, I think, is really going to boom in the next 20-odd years. But even if you're cautious about the world economy, if a world economy, I'll just take half a minute, I'll finish. If the world economy grows below 3%, it's weak. If it grows above 4%, it's strong. If the world economy just grew by 3.5% on average over the next 20 years, and that is not an even optimistic forecast, that's a pretty bog standard forecast because it allows for the big problems in Europe in the near term. If the world economy grows 3.5%, average global incomes grow by 2/3 over the next 20 years. If you're more optimistic, those figures go higher. So when we sit here, it's not a case of Europe versus the world. It's a case of, in my view, we've got to be thinking globally about positioning Britain in this growing global economy. And for Europe, it's too much process over progress. And we need to be thinking more about progress than process.
Tim?
Well, I didn't really catch the question, to be honest, but I'm going to pick up what Gerard is saying on this question of the European Union, the share of world output is collapsing. And obviously this is very important in terms of where British companies and individuals, where they think about the future. And the question is why is it collapsing? Because the fall in the share of output isn't just relative to the developing countries, it's also within the developed country world. In other words, the European Union is declining in importance compared with obviously America, Australia, and other wealthy countries. And surely the answer is too much regulation. That's a large part of it. It's not the only answer, but it's a large part of it. And, this is part of the explanation for why I haven't got it with me in this, but I did do, as part of what I've done this summer, I actually worked out the increase in productivity in the developed countries apart from the EU. And in most developed world, it's about 1.25% a year. In the EU, it's about 0.5% a year. These regulations will make us poorer. The simplest, and it's therefore, all this stuff about renegotiation, I'm sorry, and it's not going to happen. We should just leave. There is a big world out there. All we talk about these problems and the rest of it. Look, most countries do not belong to the European Union, and they're fine. Okay? All we have to do is like most countries in the world and leave this group of failing, stagnant, inadequate economies that we got mixed up with. Thank you.
Okay. Lars, would you like to make a final comment on our proceedings this evening?
I think we forgot a question from the back there about why could bankers not in the 70s foresee this misery. I think you have to remember that we're struggling big time predicting the stock markets 3 months from now, right? So it's a bit of a tall order, and I feel personally excused as I was 10 years old and wanted to be an archaeologist when Denmark entered the EU. And I must admit, I was politically interested as a young man. I was a young conservative, and then certainly the Danish young conservatives were very supportive of the ideas of the liberalization of the markets, etc. at the time. So I think they were selling us something different to what it has turned out to be, just to not forget that question. On quick wins, I had hoped, to be honest, I don't know if everybody shared that, but I had hoped for more of a protest vote in the European parliamentary elections, because I think that's a kind of shock to the system that you may not necessarily want at a local, national level, but you want them in those kind of contexts where people vote a little bit more freely. And we had a party that's never been above third or fourth in Danish national polls that came out as clearly the biggest party as a protest against the EU in this parliamentary election. You had obviously a strong election for the UKIP here, and in other European countries, France, you had some surprising results. While some of those parties are not necessarily the ideal thing for your national agenda, I had really hoped for an even bigger protest vote, because I think that's what could wake up people. I mean, politicians don't lead. Politicians follow how they get their jobs and how to keep them for a long period of time. So hopefully next time we have a European election, although that's a very long time to wait, and hopefully you won't even have to vote in it, hopefully that the protest vote and the whole breakdown of this system will be so evident that there will be a wake-up call somehow. But I don't see any sort of immediate quick win. I mean, I think you're staying out of the banking union as far as I know, which is certainly, we can't call it a quick win, but at least it's not joining yet another disaster, right? So I don't know. I think it's a very complicated situation. I think the agenda is different in reality for most of the elite of Brussels to the one that actually is being presented to the peoples of Europe. I think the peoples of Europe are getting increasingly fed up, so I think there is some hope. But it's a very, very strong intrinsic dynamic you have in an institution that's so strongly ingrained and has so much power as EU already have. So I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. And at the end of the day, I'll wait with interest to see your referendum in this country.
Thank you very much indeed. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that we've been privileged tonight to have such outstanding speakers here that have given us an insight into the depth of their experience and knowledge on these most complex subjects. I'd be grateful if we could all show our appreciation to them. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Thanks very much.